about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club.
Right there, Brad Pitt. I think we get the idea. So here we are with our first exam review, periods 1, 2, and 3, on some of the things I'm going to test you in class on. And as you know today, I'm suffering from a little bit of a cold. So I will be drinking my hot tea with honey in it, so that I don't lose my voice. I'm going to try and go through this quickly so this doesn't last a long time. You can easily pause it and look back at it as you wish. So let's go and get started here. Period 1. Again, remember the importance of maize. It showed how Indians had a structure of society. They knew about agriculture and how to cultivate crop. So this proved that they had a society. Eventually, Europeans, as they're coming here, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and eventually the English, they will establish trade with Native Americans. This led to the Columbian Exchange, where you have food and plant life and ideas and livestock is traveling back and forth from the old world to the new. Europe benefited greatly from this because of all the food that's coming to Europe. It led to a population explosion. Eventually, the most important form of trade does become the fur trade. This is where Indians begin to take alliances with the Dutch and the French and the English, and the fur trade is what often predicated when they would have these alliances. Another thing that's important, I forgot to mention in class, is all of this as well, as the Europeans got more and more involved in trade with the Native Americans, and then trade begins to develop, they start to move further away from the old European style of feudalism, and they go into mercantilism and eventually capitalism. So this is a precursor to what eventually will become capitalism. And war is what is something that just eventually will just really hurt Indian society. I mean, it's war. All right, period 2. Looking at the Chesapeake area of Virginia, you have Jamestown, 1607, John Smith. But John Smith was also helping in advertising the New World. He wrote 2 books, one on the history of Virginia and the other history of New England. And it's these history books that also are used to advertise and convince young people to migrate over here to the Americas. Of course, it's a tobacco-based economy with a lot of indentured servitude that eventually leads to slavery. A high death rate. Again, rivers were very important for life. The James River especially was a massive river. Your settlement is closer to the river. It's easier access to the Atlantic Ocean and trade. It also keeps you away from some of the swamp areas where mosquitoes and malaria and dysentery run rampant. The other thing I mentioned in some of the classes, I didn't mention in all, but with the high death rate, that also eventually led to land rights for women, because it's mostly men who are dying. So with a large group of now widowed women, this will lead to more land rights for women in the Americas. Some other issues that they were dealing with in the South, of course, the Maryland Toleration Act. Now, not only was this something about religious freedom, perhaps, religious toleration, but there's also one excerpt in the Toleration Act that banned hate speech. So it was also a beginning of trying to limit what we would call today hate speech in America. Right? You have, this is a Catholic colony in Maryland, and they want to start growing more tobacco and become more economically viable. But they need more settlers. Catholics generally didn't want to come here. There were all these religious wars in Europe. They want to make sure that in the Americas there will be no religious wars. So they passed this first type of Toleration Act, but it was also an anti-hate speech act. Of course, slave codes, as more and more slavery develops. The one specific one in Virginia dealt with the idea that you could not inherit the status of your father. And under English law, sons especially inherit the status of their father. But in Virginia, they changed that to mom, your mother. They wanted to make sure that there'd be no mixed races, but they also wanted to guarantee that there would be a continuous labor force in Virginia as well with slaves. Bacon's rebellion is an indentured servant rebellion. All these men who had gotten out of indentured servitude, but they did not receive the land that they were promised. And eventually they do rebel against Virginia, and it ends in total disaster, right? Nathaniel Bacon isn't an indentured servant. He's mad because of the fur trade, and he leads this army to try and create a Virginia empire, and then he dies. He dies terrible of dysentery. Just not a good end for him. My tea. Love that honey. Economic issues as well. The Navigation Acts. These were laws. The word acts are laws that forced the colonists to trade only with England. You could only trade with the mother country. Remember, they're operating under mercantilism, this economic system where the colonists are there for the good of the mother country. In the colonies, they procure the various raw materials, minerals, gold, other precious metals, lumber, fur, tobacco, fish, whatever it is. And England comes and buys it from them, but not at very good prices. They turn it into some sort of a finished product and eventually sell it back. This product is sold back to the colonies at high prices. But they realize that the colonists do need coin, they do need some money here, so they do not ever really rigorously enforce the Navigation Acts. They will practice solitary neglect for about 100 years. And this eventually is what's going to lead to rebellion. This eventually leads to an independent spirit with the Americans, and by the 1750s, they don't want to deal with any of these laws of the English anymore. In New England, right, you have the Puritans, the Separatists. The Separatists come first, the Puritans come second. These are these Calvinist religions. They believe in predestination, your covenant of grace. Now the Mayflower Compact, the Separatists do come first. And this is, remember, they came on the Mayflower, and there's only a small group of Separatists on the Mayflower. It's mostly Anglicans. And they have to convince these Anglicans to stay with them. They were all supposed to go to Jamestown, but they got lost, if you know what I mean, at Cape Cod, hundreds of miles away. And in order to convince the Anglicans to stay, they write a paragraph. It's just a paragraph, but it's basically an idea of shared government, that no one is going to have any bigger say over anybody else, and it convinced those Anglicans to stay. A decade later, the Puritans come. They want to build a perfect society, a city upon a hill. But very quickly, it's going to fall into some problems. A couple of dissenters. Roger Williams begins to argue against the concept of government and religion being together. He starts to preach the idea of separation of church and state. He never says those words, but that's the concept that he's talking about, that the church and government should not be one. Anne Hutchinson is the woman who begins, she is such a covenant of grace devotee that she begins to preach that you don't have to follow any man's rules, antinomianism. She can do whatever she wants. You're saved no matter what. And she thinks she's smarter than the men, which she basically is. She eventually claims that God spoke to her directly, and that gets her banished. But more problems eventually for the Puritans here. They come in 1630. By 1662, the children are growing up, some grandchildren are growing up, and the idea of predestination, covenant of grace, is being lost on everybody. They don't really understand what this is, this idea of a personal conversion in your heart. No one can tell you you're going to heaven. It's already in your heart. It's as though God's Spirit is speaking to you. But they don't understand this anymore. They don't understand this idea of a personal conversion, covenant of grace. So fewer and fewer are going to church, especially as they're leaving the center of religion in Boston and going west. So they come up with a compromise, the halfway covenant. If your children get baptized, they can be halfway members or partial members in the church, come back to church, and eventually perhaps understand covenant of grace and become full members. That works a little bit, But over the ensuing decades, 6, 7 decades now will pass. The Enlightenment will highly influence these individuals, and eventually a great awakening will happen, and Puritan theology will go under a major change. All right, you have Jonathan Edwards preaching sinners in the hands of an angry God. Ooh, I didn't lose my voice. That was pretty good. You know, God of heaven hold you in contempt and hold you over the pit of a fire as one would hold a spider. Right? It's this idea now of scaring you a little bit. It's very theatrical, trying to get you to repent, to do good deeds, more of a covenant of works idea than a covenant of grace. So it becomes like a religious battlefield between these new light preachers who are very theatrical, very emotional appeal, and the old lights, the old type Puritan preacher who wants to hold on to covenant of grace. He wants to keep a strict religious kind of a way of teaching and a code. Very theatrical over here. Remember, you have George Whitefield, who could say Mesopotamia, and the crowds go crazy over that. I don't quite understand that, but when you don't have TV, you don't have Twitter, it's sort of like walking around when you only have one arm, you can't use the other arm, right, Gabby? Ha, gotcha. So that's what's going on here. This great awakening, highly influenced by the Enlightenment. I don't know. That's probably going to go. No one knows what I'm doing right there, but Gabby knows. Anyways, it's also at the eve of revolution. The Americans are at war. I should say, actually, the British are in constant state of war with France. They're fighting over control of the Ohio River Valley, and this eventually breaks out into this major war known as the French Indian War in America. It's the 7 Years' War in Europe. Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, trying to get the colonies to join or die. That's the snake in the background, and it's a failure. The Americans really don't trust each other. The colonists don't really trust each other, so the Albany Plan of Union doesn't work. But England does win this war, and they become the British Empire. They gain all the territory of North America, and they go massively, massively in debt. Which now brings us to period 3. Going into debt, they're going to start taxing. The Stamp Act. This is not only a tax that you cannot smuggle because it's on paper good, but it's this idea of internally taxing them. Right? They didn't mind the external taxes. They like to tax themselves. And now the British are coming in and taxing them directly, and it's a tax you can't smuggle around. So they begin to protest. Sons of Liberty, boycotts. They argue no taxation without representation, which isn't not exactly what they wanted, but it's nice propaganda. But the British would argue you are represented. You are virtually represented because we have a government called Parliament. And Parliament represents everybody. So in essence, you are represented. Colonists aren't going to have anything to do with that. They don't like that. Local committees of correspondence, constantly keeping everybody informed as to what's going on in all the colonies. It's also a nice way not only to spread information, but propaganda as well. Kind of take what's going on with the British and embellishing it a little bit. Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration. Both of these are heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers. They eventually develop a government known as the Articles of Confederation. It is a states' rights government. Excuse me, my voice is going. There it is. That basically gives the powers to the states. The one really good law that they pass is the Northwest Ordinance. How do you turn territory into a state? But especially it outlaws slavery in the Northwest. Eventually, the concept of economics is what starts to hurt the country. The government cannot raise taxes. It cannot regulate trade. So they allow for a convention to be held in Philadelphia. But James Madison and other people there have an idea of not just amending the articles, but to get rid of the articles and write a new constitution. But in order to get this, there's going to be a lot of compromise, and that one of the most infamous compromises is the 3/5 compromise that deals with slaves, counting 3/5 of your population towards overall representation in the House of Representatives and the electoral vote, which gives the southern states really all the power now in government. A continued debate over federal power constantly happens. You know, who has the right to tax? Who has the right to create an economic system? They're constantly going to be arguing now. And eventually, all the way through the Civil War, this is going to happen. I do have quotes from Federalist number 10 and 51. And just to remind you, 10 deals with factions. You cannot crush liberty, nor can you give everybody the exact same thought when it comes to a faction. You can only pass laws to control their effects. And of course, 51 deals with the idea if men were angels, you'd need no government. If we were a government ruled by angels, it'd be a perfect government. But we're men governing men, so we need a government that can only govern the people, but govern itself. Perhaps one of the, in fact, really one of the best expressions as to why man needs a government. Of course, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, he wants to create a national bank. He wants to assume all debt, the state's debts and the federal debt, into one debt. It's called assumption. And he wants to create a tariff. These economic policies of Hamilton enrage the South, make Thomas Jefferson and James Madison very angry, so they form political parties. Washington will never join a political party. In fact, he warns of political parties in his farewell address. Jay's Treaty deals with a treaty with England. It was supposed to be about impressment, but just as you heard Tom Pitt tell you about Fight Club, they weren't allowed to talk about impressment. They can only talk about forts in Ohio, and then the British never leave those forts anyway. So it's a waste of a treaty. But, you know, Washington also warned of political parties, but he also warned, as you know, of entangling alliances with Europe. The big event that was taking place in Europe, remember, Washington declared neutrality during the French Revolution. It's the French Revolution that Washington was extremely afraid of. He declares neutrality during that, and he's also warning the nation, don't get involved in the French Revolution. Don't get involved making any alliances with anybody over there. That's crazy. That's some crazy stuff. All right, that's it. We'll see everybody tomorrow.